Centuries ago, in the fertile lands of ancient India, there existed a prosperous kingdom ruled by a monarch known as much for his wealth as for his explosive temper. King Ajatashatru, whose name echoed throughout the region, was infamous for his inability to remain silent for more than a few moments. His shouts of command, raucous laughter, and incessant opinions reverberated through the ornate halls of the royal palace day and night. The palace, an imposing structure of marble and gold, stood majestically at the heart of the capital. Its lush gardens, filled with exotic flowers and crystal-clear fountains, contrasted sharply with the chaotic noise that emanated from within. Servants tiptoed through the corridors, fearing to awaken the king's wrath with the slightest sound. Ministers, once wise advisors, now spent most of their time nervously agreeing with every word uttered by the monarch, no matter how absurd. Ajatashatru ruled with an iron fist and a thunderous voice. His council meetings were endless monologues, where his ideas, often impulsive and poorly thought out, were turned into law without debate or consideration. Although the kingdom was rich in resources, it began to show signs of strain under this chaotic and noisy reign. The subjects, exhausted from the constant clamor, longed for moments of peace. In the streets of the city, people whispered about the quieter times of the past. Some even dared to suggest that the king's incessant noise was a reflection of the turmoil in his own mind, an unsettled soul unable to find serenity. It was in this atmosphere of unrest that rumors began to circulate about a Buddhist sage who lived in the distant mountains. This monk, known only as Mana, meaning silence in Sanskrit, was said not to have spoken a single word in decades. Travelers returning from the mountains spoke of an indescribable aura of peace surrounding the hermitage where Mana meditated. Stories of Mana soon reached the ever-attentive ears of King Ajatashatru. At first, he laughed disdainfully at the idea of someone choosing silence voluntarily. "What foolishness!" he bellowed to his court. "How can a man be wise if he does not use his voice to command, to teach, to impose himself on the world?" However, as days passed, the king found himself increasingly intrigued and irritated by the idea of this silent monk. How could someone wield influence without words? How could wisdom be conveyed in silence? These questions began to haunt the king, disturbing his sleep and further increasing his daytime agitation. Finally, unable to bear the mystery any longer, Ajatashatru decided to summon Mana to the palace. He sent his fastest messengers to the mountains, with strict orders to bring the silent sage to him. The mission was not easy. Many messengers got lost in the winding mountain paths, and others were so distracted by the peace of the hermitage that they nearly forgot their purpose. After weeks of searching, Mana was found. To the messenger's surprise, the monk accepted the king's invitation with a simple nod. Without making any preparations or uttering a single word, he merely rose from his meditative position and began walking toward the palace. The journey back was a surreal experience for the king's messengers. Accustomed to the frenzy and constant noise of the court, they found themselves enveloped in a deep and inexplicably comforting silence. Some later reported that, during that journey, they experienced a mental clarity they had never known before. When news of Mana's approach reached the palace, a wave of anticipation and apprehension swept through the place. The courtiers, used to pleasing the king with constant flattery, did not know how to react to someone who did not speak. Ajatashatru himself, for the first time in years, found himself momentarily speechless. Mana's arrival at the palace was a unique spectacle. Dressed in a simple orange robe, barefoot, and with an expression of absolute serenity, the monk entered the throne room in silence. His walk was slow and deliberate, each step a meditation in motion. The contrast between his simplicity and the palace's ostentatious luxury could not have been starker. King Ajatashatru, seated on his golden throne, watched the monk's approach with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. The silence preceding Mana seemed to have a weight of its own, filling the throne room with an almost tangible presence. For the first time in his life, the king felt the urge to hold back his words, as if he were in the presence of something greater than he could comprehend. When Mana finally stopped before the throne and bowed respectfully, the king found his voice. And thus began one of the most extraordinary encounters in the history of that kingdom. a confrontation between the relentless noise of worldly power and the profound silence of spiritual wisdom. The throne room, usually a whirlwind of activity and noise, was engulfed in a tense silence. King Ajatasattu, accustomed to commanding every interaction with his imposing presence and thunderous voice, found himself in an unprecedented situation. Before him stood Mana, the sage from the mountains, whose mere presence seemed to fill the space with a palpable stillness. For a few moments that felt like an eternity, no one moved or spoke. The courtiers, used to reacting to the slightest gesture from the king, remained motionless, their eyes nervously shifting between the monarch and the monk. Ajatasattu himself, known for his impatience, felt strangely compelled to respect this moment of silence. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, the king broke the silence. His voice, usually booming, sounded almost hesitant at first. "Welcome to my kingdom, wise Mana. I've heard much about your wisdom and the power of your silence." The king paused, as if the word silence was a foreign concept to him. "I summoned you here to share your teachings with me and my court. Tell us, what can silence offer that words cannot?" Mana did not reply. His eyes, calm and compassionate, met the king's, but his lips remained sealed. The monk simply inclined his head slightly, as if inviting the king to continue. Disconcerted by the lack of response, Ajatasattu pressed on, his voice gaining volume and urgency. "Surely you haven't come here just to stand still. My kingdom faces challenges. My people need guidance. How can silence solve problems? How can you rule without commands, without laws proclaimed aloud?" The hall echoed with the king's words, but as they faded, Mana's silence filled the space once more. The monk remained unmoved, his serene posture a stark contrast to the king's growing agitation. Frustrated, Ajatasattu rose from his throne. He began pacing back and forth, gesturing vigorously as he spoke. "Look at this palace, the riches of this kingdom. All of this was built through the power of words, orders given, agreements made, stories told. How can silence compete with that?" As the king spoke, something strange began to happen. The more he tried to fill the silence with his words, the clearer it became that they were just that, words. Empty, repetitive, increasingly less convincing, even to his own ears. Hours passed. The sun crossed the sky, casting ever-lengthening shadows through the ornate windows of the throne room. Ajatasattu continued his monologue, alternating between questions, demands, and even pleas for a response. Mana, meanwhile, remained a constant, silent presence, his serene face and gentle eyes never leaving the king. Gradually, the frenetic energy of Ajatasattu began to wane. His voice, hoarse from so much talking, grew quieter. His once vigorous steps slowed, and then something extraordinary happened. In the middle of a sentence, the king stopped abruptly. For the first time in his life, he truly listened to the silence. And in that silence, he began to hear things he had never noticed before. The soft rustling of the leaves in the palace garden, the distant murmur of the city beyond the walls, the sound of his own breathing, labored after hours of uninterrupted speech, and surprisingly, the beating of his own heart. In that moment of forced quietude, Ajatasattu experienced a clarity he had never known. The worries and constant demands that usually filled his mind seemed to dissipate, leaving in their place an unexpected peace. The king looked at Mana with new eyes. What had once seemed like an irritating refusal to speak, he now recognized as an invaluable gift. The sage was not refusing to teach, he was teaching in the deepest way possible. Slowly, Ajatasattu returned to his throne and sat down. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt no need to speak, to assert his authority, to fill the space with the sound of his own voice. Instead, he allowed himself to simply be present, immersed in the silence that Mana had brought with him. The courtiers watched, astonished at this transformation. The king, who had never been silent for more than a few seconds, now seemed comfortable in the quiet. The tension that had once filled the throne room had dissipated, replaced by an atmosphere of calm contemplation. As night fell, enveloping the palace in soft shadows, a profound realization began to dawn on Ajatasattu. True power, he understood, did not lie in his words or his throne, but in the silence that allowed wisdom to bloom. That night, the kingdom witnessed something extraordinary. Its king, known for his turbulent demeanor, found peace in silence. And in that peace, the seeds of a profound transformation were planted. The dawn found King Ajatasattu still seated on his throne, immersed in a silence he had never before experienced. The night had passed like a breath, and yet it seemed to have lasted an eternity. The monk Mauna remained in the same spot, his presence a silent anchor in the sea of the king's discoveries. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the throne room windows, Ajatasattu felt as if he were waking from a long dream. His eyes, once clouded by constant agitation, now gleamed with newfound clarity. He looked around, seeing his palace and his courtiers as if for the first time. "How could I have been so blind?" thought the king, marveling at the wealth of details he now perceived in his surroundings. The intricate tapestries on the walls, the delicate woodwork of the furniture, even the expressions on his servants' faces. Everything seemed new and full of meaning. Slowly, Ajatasattu rose from his throne. With deliberate steps, he walked to one of the great windows overlooking the city. Outside, his capital was awakening to another day. The king watched the activity in the streets, hearing the distant sounds of the marketplace coming to life. For the first time, he truly listened to the heartbeat of his kingdom. Turning to Mauna, Ajatasattu did something that astonished everyone present. He knelt before the silent monk. In a soft voice, almost a whisper, the king spoke. "Master Mauna, in one night you have taught me more than I have learned in my entire life. I ask you to stay and continue guiding me on this new path." Mauna, with a gentle smile, placed his hand on the king's head in a gesture of blessing. Still without uttering a word, the monk nodded, accepting the request. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, a profound transformation took place in the kingdom. Ajatasattu, once known for his explosive temper and endless words, became a contemplative and compassionate ruler. The king instituted daily periods of silence throughout the palace. At first, this caused confusion and even resistance among the courtiers and servants. But gradually, everyone began to appreciate these moments of quiet, discovering in them a source of peace and mental clarity. The royal council meetings, once dominated by the king's endless monologues, transformed into sessions of attentive listening and careful reflection. Ajatasattu learned to value the opinions of his advisors, often allowing long moments of silence after each speech to truly absorb what was said. This new approach soon began to have positive effects throughout the kingdom. Wiser decisions were made, conflicts were resolved more easily, and a general atmosphere of calm and contentment spread across the capital and beyond. Ajatasattu himself dedicated several hours each day to the practice of silent meditation, guided by Mauna's constant example. Through this practice, the king discovered an inner source of wisdom and compassion that transformed not only his way of ruling, but his entire being. One of the most remarkable moments of this transformation occurred during a large public assembly. The people, accustomed to their king's long and grandiose speeches, were surprised when Ajatasattu simply sat in silence before them. For several minutes, the king merely observed his subjects with eyes full of compassion. When he finally spoke, his words were few but profound. "My people, for a long time I believed that a king's strength lay in his words and his gold. Now I know that true strength resides in silence and the wisdom that flows from it. May we together build a kingdom not on the noise of our ambitions, but on the quiet of our mutual understanding." The impact of these words was immense. The people, seeing the transformation of their king, were inspired to embark on their own journeys of self-discovery and inner growth. Over the years, Ajatasattu's kingdom became known not for its material wealth or military power, but for its culture of peace, wisdom, and deep understanding. Travelers from distant lands came to experience the unique atmosphere of tranquility and clarity that permeated the capital. And through it all, Mauna remained a silent and constant presence, a living reminder of the transformative power of silence. The story of King Ajatasattu and the wise Mauna teaches us that true power does not lie in words spoken aloud or in grand actions, but in the ability to be silent and to listen, to ourselves, to others, and to the world around us. It reminds us that often the most profound transformations occur not when we speak, but when we finally allow ourselves to hear the silence. In this increasingly noisy world, the lesson of Mauna and Ajatasattu remains as relevant as ever. In silence, we can find the wisdom, peace, and strength to transform not only our lives, but the world around us.